A little girl vanished in Orlando. For 31 days, her mother said nothing, and when the truth finally appeared, it shocked the entire country. 10-second opening short, slow, natural. Before we begin, let's settle in. Where are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? So, let's start from the beginning. The morning of June 16th, 2008, started like any other morning in Orlando, Florida. The sun rose over the suburbs, children played in backyards, families gathered for breakfast, but inside one small house on Hope Spring Drive, something had already gone terribly wrong. Casey Anthony was 22 years old that summer. She lived with her parents, George and Cindy Anthony, in a quiet neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else. Casey had a daughter named Kaylee, a bright-eyed little girl who had just turned 2 years old in August of 2005. Kaylee had dark hair and a smile that could light up a room. She was the kind of child who brought joy to everyone she met. Her grandparents adored her. The neighbors loved seeing her play in the front yard. She was innocent, trusting, and full of life. But on that June morning, Kaylee Anthony was nowhere to be found. For 31 days, Casey told no one that her daughter was missing. 31 days passed while she went to parties, got a tattoo that read Bella Vita, and stayed with her boyfriend, Tony Lazzaro. She posted photos on social media, smiling at the camera, living what appeared to be a carefree life. During those 31 days, her parents asked about Kaylee repeatedly. Casey had an answer every time. "The little girl was with the nanny," she said. A woman named Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez was watching her. Casey called her Zanny the nanny. Sometimes she said they were at the beach, other times she claimed they went to Disney World or were staying with friends. Everything seemed fine on the surface. But beneath that surface, something dark was festering. Cindy Anthony grew suspicious as the days wore on. She had not seen her granddaughter in over a month. Every time she asked, Casey had another excuse. The nanny took Kaylee to the beach. They went to the theme park. They were at a friend's house. The lies piled up like stones in a well, each one sinking deeper into darkness. Cindy tried calling Casey constantly, demanding to speak to Kaylee. Casey always had a reason why that was not possible. The child was sleeping. They were in a noisy place. The phone battery was dying. George Anthony, Casey's father, also sensed something was wrong. He was a former police officer who had worked in law enforcement for years before retiring. His instincts told him that his daughter was hiding something, but he wanted to believe her. He wanted to trust that his granddaughter was safe and happy somewhere with this mysterious nanny. On July 15th, 2008, Cindy finally had enough. She had received a letter from a towing company saying that Casey's car had been impounded from an apartment complex parking lot. The car had been sitting there for weeks, abandoned. When Cindy and George went to pick up the vehicle, a horrific smell hit them the moment the trunk was opened. George had been a police officer years before. He recognized that smell instantly. It was the unmistakable odor of human decomposition. A quiet moment passed. Cindy drove the car home anyway. She cleaned it. She tried to convince herself that the smell came from rotting garbage in the trunk. She found a bag of trash and focused on that explanation. But deep down, she knew better. That evening, after calling Casey's friends and getting nowhere, she tracked her daughter down at Tony Lazzaro's apartment and dragged her home. The confrontation that followed would change everything. "Where is Kaylee?" Cindy demanded. Casey repeated the same story she had been telling for weeks. The nanny had her, but this time, Cindy would not accept that answer. She grabbed the phone and called 911. On that call, which would later be played in courtrooms across the country, Cindy said something chilling. She told the operator that her daughter's car smelled like there had been a dead body in it. She also stated that she had not seen her granddaughter in 31 days and that her daughter had given her nothing but lies. The police arrived at the Anthony home that night. They questioned Casey for hours. Her story began to unravel immediately. She claimed that Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez, the nanny, had kidnapped Kaylee 31 days earlier from a park. She said she'd been conducting her own investigation, trying to find her daughter on her own. She gave police an address where the nanny supposedly lived at the Sawgrass Apartments. When officers went to check, they found an empty apartment that had been vacant for months. No one by that name had ever lived there. Nothing Casey said could be verified. The phone numbers she provided did not exist. The people she named could not be found or had never met Kaylee. Her place of employment, Universal Studios, where she claimed to work as an event coordinator, had no record of her ever being employed there. In fact, Casey had been fired from Universal years earlier. Everything was a lie built upon another lie. When detectives took her to Universal to show them her office, she led them through the hallways before finally admitting she did not work there. She had made it all up. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered something even more disturbing. Casey's internet search history from March of 2008 showed searches for terms like chloroform, how to make chloroform, and neck breaking. She had also searched for information about household weapons. Someone using her computer had visited a website about chloroform 84 times. These searches had been conducted in the months before Kaylee disappeared. The computer forensics revealed a pattern of someone researching ways to sedate or harm another person. The case exploded across national media. Every news channel covered the story. People across the country became obsessed with finding out what happened to little Kaylee Anthony. Volunteers searched parks, forests, and waterways around Orlando. They held vigils and prayer circles. The face of the missing toddler appeared on billboards and milk cartons. Thousands of people donated time and money to the search efforts. The case became one of the most publicized missing child investigations in American history. Casey was arrested and charged with child neglect, lying to investigators, and obstruction of justice. She sat in jail while the search for her daughter continued. During this time, she showed little emotion. She did not cry for her missing child. She did not beg for Kaylee's safe return. Her behavior struck investigators and the public as cold and detached. In jailhouse videos, she complained about news coverage and worried about what people were saying about her online. She seemed more concerned with her own image than with finding her daughter. Her parents visited her in jail repeatedly. George and Cindy begged her to tell them where Kaylee was. Casey insisted the child was alive and would be found. She told her mother that she could feel in her heart that Kaylee was close. These conversations were recorded and would later be analyzed by experts and the public. Many people heard manipulation in Casey's voice. Others heard a young woman in deep denial or psychological distress. Months passed with no sign of Kaylee. Then, on December 11, 2008, a utility worker named Roy Kronk was checking a wooded area near the Anthony home. He had actually called police about this same location back in August, saying he saw something suspicious, but officers had not thoroughly searched the area at that time. The responding deputy had looked briefly but found nothing. Now, in December, Roy returned to the spot while working in the area. Something still did not feel right to him. What he found would haunt him forever. Hidden in the palmetto brush, less than a quarter mile from the Anthony house, Roy discovered a small skull. It was wrapped in a blanket and placed inside a laundry bag. Duct tape covered the mouth area, still adhered to the skull even after months of decomposition. Nearby, investigators found more bones, tiny bones belonging to a child. They also found clothing and a stuffed animal that Kaylee's grandparents recognized immediately. The shirt said, "Big Trouble Comes Small" on it. Cindy remembered that shirt. She had bought it for Kaylee. The remains were identified through DNA testing. Kaylee Marie Anthony had been dead since the summer. While her mother partied and got tattoos, while volunteers searched day and night, the little girl had been lying in those woods the entire time. She had been there through summer heat and autumn rains. She had been there when her mother sat in jail claiming the child was alive. The location was so close to the house that investigators believed whoever put her there knew the area intimately. Everything went silent. Casey Anthony was charged with first-degree murder. The prosecutors were seeking the death penalty. They argued that she had used chloroform to sedate her daughter, then suffocated her with duct tape. They believed Casey wanted to be free of the responsibility of motherhood. She wanted to party with her friends and live the life of a single woman in her 20s. Kaylee had become an obstacle to that life. So Casey eliminated that obstacle. The prosecution painted a picture of a selfish, narcissistic young woman who valued her social life more than her own child. The defense team, led by attorney Jose Baez, told a completely different story. They claimed that Kaylee had accidentally drowned in the family pool on June 16, 2008. They alleged that George Anthony, Casey's father, had found the body and helped cover up the death. They painted Casey as a victim of sexual abuse who had been trained by her father to lie and hide the truth. The drowning was an accident, they insisted, and the cover-up was driven by panic and years of dysfunction. According to this narrative, George had molested Casey since childhood, teaching her to hide secrets and smile through trauma. When Kaylee drowned, George allegedly took control and disposed of the body, instructing Casey to act as if nothing had happened. The trial began in May of 2011. It lasted 6 weeks and captivated the nation. Millions of people watched the proceedings on television, major networks provided gavel-to-gavel coverage. People took off work to watch. The evidence presented was disturbing. Forensic experts testified about the smell of decomposition in Casey's car. Air samples taken from the trunk showed chemical signatures consistent with human decomposition. They found traces of chloroform in the trunk. Hair that was microscopically consistent with Kaylee's was discovered there as well, and it showed signs of decomposition, meaning it had come from a dead body rather than naturally shed hair. The prosecution showed the jury those internet searches. They played jailhouse phone calls where Casey seemed more concerned about her boyfriend than her missing daughter. In one call, she snapped at her mother for focusing on finding Kaylee instead of getting Casey out of jail. They presented testimony from friends who said Casey had lied constantly about everything from her job to her parents' health to where Kaylee was. One friend testified that Casey had thrown a party at her boyfriend's apartment while Kaylee was missing. Another described how normal and happy Casey seemed during those 31 days. There were no signs of grief or worry. The duct tape became a central piece of evidence. Prosecutors argued that 3 pieces of tape had been placed over Kaylee's nose and mouth, forming a death mask. The tape was from a roll found at the Anthony home. It had been placed there deliberately to suffocate the child. But the defense countered that the tape could have been placed on the body after death, possibly by someone staging the scene. They brought in experts who questioned whether the tape had actually been on the face at all, suggesting it might have moved during decomposition. But the defense created reasonable doubt. They pointed out that the cause of death could not be determined because the body had decomposed so severely. The medical examiner ruled the manner of death as homicide, but could not say exactly how Kaylee died. No chloroform was found in the remains. No physical trauma was visible on the bones. The defense challenged the forensic evidence, bringing in their own experts to dispute the prosecution's claims. One defense expert said the air sample testing was junk science. Another claimed the hair evidence was inconclusive. They reminded the jury that no one actually saw what happened to Kaylee on June 16, 2008. Jose Baez delivered a powerful closing argument. He told the jury that Casey was a flawed person, a liar, but not a murderer. He said the state had not proven how Kaylee died or who killed her. He hammered on the lack of physical evidence directly tying Casey to murder. He reminded them that in America, you cannot convict someone based on suspicion or dislike. You need proof beyond a reasonable doubt. On July 5, 2011, after less than 11 hours of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed. Media from around the world waited outside. People held their breath as the verdicts were read. Not guilty of first-degree murder. Not guilty of aggravated child abuse. Not guilty of aggravated manslaughter. Casey Anthony was convicted only on 4 misdemeanor counts of lying to law enforcement. The courtroom erupted. People gasped and cried. Outside the courthouse, crowds screamed in anger. Some people sobbed, others shouted that the jury had failed Kaylee. The verdict shocked the nation. It became one of the most controversial decisions in modern American legal history. Several jurors later spoke about their decision. They said they believed Casey was probably involved in Kaylee's death somehow, but the prosecution had not proven murder. They felt sick about letting her go, but they had taken an oath to follow the law. Without knowing the cause of death or having direct evidence of murder, they could not, in good conscience, vote guilty on the serious charges. The reasonable doubt had been planted too deeply. Casey walked out of jail on July 17, 2011, after serving nearly 3 years. She disappeared from public view, living in various locations under different circumstances. She stayed with her attorney for a while. She gave one interview years later where she maintained her innocence and suggested that Kaylee's death might have been an accident that snowballed out of control. The public remained divided. Some believed she got away with murder. Others thought she was a scapegoat for a tragic accident. Most agreed the truth remained hidden. The case remained one of the most controversial verdicts in American legal history. It sparked debates about the justice system, media coverage of trials, and the burden of proof in criminal cases. Law schools studied it, television shows analyzed it, books were written about it, everyone had an opinion. Kaylee Marie Anthony would have been 17 years old today. She never got to grow up, never went to her first day of school, never celebrated another birthday. She was 2 years old when her life ended in the summer of 2008. Her death occurred in a home where she should have been safe, protected by the people who were supposed to love her most. What really happened in that house on Hope Spring Drive may never be fully known. The only certainty is that a little girl died and someone knows the truth. Whether justice was served remains a question that divides people to this day. The case of Kaylee Anthony stands as a reminder that sometimes the darkest crimes happen in the brightest suburban neighborhoods, and sometimes the truth stays buried even when the secrets are finally exposed. The system is designed to protect the innocent, but sometimes that same system lets the guilty walk free. The story does not end with a neat conclusion because the truth never emerged. There was no confession, no final revelation, no moment of justice that satisfied the millions who followed the case. There was only a little girl's remains found in the woods, a mother who showed no grief, and a jury that could not convict without certainty. The rest is speculation, anger, and a haunting question that will never be answered. In December 2009, Susan Powell vanished from her Utah home without a trace. What began as a simple missing person case soon uncovered something far darker: a husband's obsession, a father's twisted desires, and a family destroyed by secrets no one saw coming. This is The Vanishing of Susan Powell, a story of love, control, and unspeakable evil hidden behind suburban walls. Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. I want to ask, where are you watching from right now, and what time is it there? Drop it in the comments. I want to see how far this story reaches. Now let's begin the story. In the quiet suburban streets of West Valley City, Utah, the winter of 2009 began like any other. Families decorated their homes with Christmas lights. Children played in the snow, and life moved forward with predictable routine. But on the morning of December 7th, 2009, something happened that would shatter one family forever and create a mystery so dark, so twisted, that it would haunt investigators for years to come. This is the story of Susan Powell, a young mother of two who vanished without a trace, and the horrifying truth that slowly emerged about the man she called her husband. Susan Cox Powell was 28 years old, a devoted mother to her two young sons, Charlie, age 4, and Braden, age 2. She was known by friends and family as sweet, caring, and deeply religious. She had a beautiful smile and an infectious laugh. She worked as a financial analyst and seemed to have built a good life. But behind closed doors, Susan's marriage to her husband, Josh Powell, was crumbling. According to her personal journals, which would later be discovered, Susan had been living in fear. She wrote extensively about Josh's controlling behavior, his volatile temper, and his increasingly bizarre obsession with her. But the most disturbing entries in her journal weren't about Josh alone. They were about Josh's father, Stephen Powell, a man whose presence in their lives had become suffocating and sinister. Stephen Powell was not a typical father-in-law. He was a man with dark, twisted obsessions. He had moved into Josh and Susan's home, and according to Susan's writings, he had developed an inappropriate and frightening fixation on her. She described how Stephen would stare at her constantly, how he would record her without permission, and how he made sexually suggestive comments that made her skin crawl. Investigators would later discover that Stephen had thousands of images of Susan on his computer. Photos taken secretly, some zoomed in on intimate parts of her body. He had journals filled with sexual fantasies about her. This was not just a man who made his daughter-in-law uncomfortable. This was a predator living under the same roof as his victim. Susan had confided in close friends about the situation. She told them that Stephen had even sung songs to her, original compositions that were disturbingly romantic and sexual in nature. He would perform them in front of Josh, who seemed either oblivious or simply didn't care. Susan felt trapped. She had no privacy in her own home. She couldn't shower, couldn't change clothes, couldn't have a moment to herself without feeling Stephen's eyes on her. She documented everything in her journal, And in one particularly chilling entry dated several months before her disappearance, Susan wrote, "If I die, it may not be an accident, even if it looks like one. Take care of my boys." The financial situation in the Powell household was dire. Josh had recently lost his job, though he hadn't told Susan right away. He would leave the house each morning pretending to go to work, but instead, he was spending hours at the library, using the internet, or sitting in his car. The family was drowning in debt. Their house was in foreclosure. Susan was the sole breadwinner, and the stress was overwhelming. She had begun making plans to leave Josh, to take her boys and start over. She had contacted a divorce attorney and was preparing to file papers after the holidays. She wanted to give her sons one last normal Christmas before everything changed. But she would never get that chance. On the night of December 6th, 2009, Susan put her sons to bed, just like she did every night. She had just returned from church, and neighbors reported seeing the lights on in the Powell home around 8 p.m. That was the last confirmed sighting of Susan Powell alive. The next morning, Josh Powell called his family from the road. He said he had taken the boys on a spontaneous camping trip in the middle of the night, in freezing temperatures, in a blizzard. He claimed Susan had been at home when they left and that he assumed she had gone to work. But when Susan's coworkers called the police to report she hadn't shown up, officers went to the Powell home. What they found was chilling. The house was locked from the outside. Inside, 2 industrial fans were running in the living room, pointed at a wet spot on the couch. The spot smelled strongly of cleaning chemicals. In the kitchen, police found Susan's purse, her wallet, her phone, and her identification. No woman leaves for work without those items. In the garage, they discovered something even more disturbing. The handle of a snow shovel was wet, and there was a small spot of blood. Josh Powell's story was falling apart, and fast. When police questioned him about the so-called camping trip, his story made no sense. He claimed he took his 2 toddlers camping at 12:30 a.m. in sub-zero temperatures during a snowstorm. He said he thought it was Sunday, not Monday, and that's why he didn't realize Susan would have work. But his sons, when gently interviewed, told a very different story. Little Charlie said that Mommy had gone camping with them. He said Mommy was in the trunk of the car. The police immediately named Josh Powell as a person of interest, though they didn't have enough evidence to arrest him. They began building their case methodically. They searched the Powell home from top to bottom. They found disturbing evidence of Josh's state of mind in the weeks before Susan disappeared. His computer search history revealed queries about natural disasters, how to hide bodies, abandoned mines in Utah, and the Simpson Springs area, a remote desert location about 75 miles southwest of Salt Lake City. They also found evidence that Josh had been selling Susan's belongings on Craigslist, including her wedding ring, while she was still missing. When confronted, Josh claimed Susan had given him permission to sell her things. It was a lie that no one believed. The camping site Josh claimed to have visited was examined by investigators. It was in the freezing wilderness of the Simpson Springs area. The story made no sense. Why would anyone take 2 toddlers camping in sub-zero temperatures in the middle of the night? Josh said he wanted to roast marshmallows and look at the stars. But the night in question had been overcast with heavy snow. There were no stars to see. When police processed Josh's vehicle, they found disturbing evidence. There was a large tarp in the back with Susan's blood on it. There were also traces of accelerant, suggesting Josh had attempted to destroy evidence by burning something. Most damning of all, cadaver dogs alerted to the scent of human decomposition in the cargo area of the vehicle. For years, Josh Powell maintained his innocence. He moved back to Washington State to live with his father, Stephen. He hired lawyers, did media interviews, and played the role of the grieving, confused husband. But investigators were building a case. They discovered that Josh had taken out a significant life insurance policy on Susan just months before her disappearance. They found evidence that he had withdrawn money, stopped going to work, and had researched how to hide bodies. His computer search history was damning, with queries about deserts, abandoned mine shafts, and decomposition. Then, In a shocking turn, Stephen Powell was arrested, not for Susan's disappearance, but for voyeurism and possession of child pornography. When police raided his home, they found the sickening evidence of his obsession with Susan and with young girls in the neighborhood. He was sentenced to prison, and Josh lost custody of his sons. The discovery of Stephen Powell's depravity opened a window into the Powell family that was more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. Stephen had been secretly recording Susan for years. He had installed hidden cameras in the bathroom. He had taken photographs of her through windows. He had compiled thousands of images, which he stored on multiple hard drives and USB drives hidden throughout his home. But it wasn't just Susan. Stephen had also been photographing neighbor girls, some as young as 8 years old, through their windows as they changed clothes or bathed. He had videos of them playing in their yards, zoomed in on their bodies. The man was a predator of the worst kind, and he had been living in the same house as Susan and her children for months. During the investigation of Stephen's home, police also found evidence that Josh had been there on December 6th and 7th, despite initially claiming he had been camping. Cell phone records showed his phone pinging off towers near his father's house in Washington, over 800 miles away, on December 7th. This was a critical piece of evidence. It meant Josh had lied about his timeline. It meant he had driven through the night, possibly with Susan's body, to dispose of evidence. Investigators began searching mining areas between Utah and Washington, focusing on abandoned mine shafts that matched Josh's internet searches. They found nothing. Susan's body remained missing. The boys, Charlie and Braden, were placed in the care of Susan's parents, Chuck and Judy Cox. The Coxes were devastated by their daughter's disappearance, but they threw themselves into caring for their grandsons. The boys were traumatized. They had nightmares. They would ask where Mommy was. And slowly, in the safety of their grandparents' home, they began to reveal pieces of what had happened that night. Charlie told his grandparents that Mommy and Daddy had a big fight. He said Daddy hurt Mommy. He said they went on a trip and Mommy was in the trunk and she didn't wake up. These statements were heartbreaking, but they weren't enough for prosecutors to charge Josh Powell with murder. They needed a body. They needed more evidence. And Josh knew it. Social workers arranged supervised visits for Josh to see his sons, hoping that one day he might tell the truth about what happened to their mother. But Josh Powell had other plans. In the months leading up to February 2012, Josh's behavior became increasingly erratic. He sold his possessions. He sent goodbye emails to family members. He wrote letters to his pastor. He was preparing for something, and the people around him were growing concerned. On February 5th, 2012, a social worker named Elizabeth Griffin Hall brought Charlie and Braden to Josh's rental home for a scheduled visit. The moment the boys ran up to the door, excited to see their father, Josh let them inside and then slammed the door in Elizabeth's face, locking it. She immediately smelled gasoline. She pounded on the door, shouting for Josh to open it. He didn't respond. She ran back to her car and called 911. The 911 call is one of the most harrowing pieces of audio ever recorded. Elizabeth is frantic, screaming that something is wrong, that she can smell gasoline, that Josh has locked her out with the children inside. The dispatcher doesn't seem to understand the urgency. Elizabeth shouts, "He won't let me in the door. I'm afraid for the kids. He took them from me and locked me out." The dispatcher calmly asks for the address, asks what the emergency is, treats it like a routine custody dispute. Elizabeth screams, "I need help now. This is an emergency. The kids are in danger." Still, the dispatcher doesn't send units with urgency. Precious minutes tick by. And then, in an explosion that could be heard for blocks, Josh Powell set his house on fire with himself and his 2 sons inside. Charlie and Braden Powell, ages 7 and 5, died of smoke inhalation and burns. Investigators later determined that Josh had attacked both boys with a hatchet before igniting the gasoline he had poured throughout the house. The boys suffered blunt force trauma to their heads and necks. They were injured, bleeding, and terrified when the fire started. Josh died from a self-inflicted hatchet wound to the head before the fire consumed him. It was a murder-suicide of unimaginable cruelty, a final act of control and rage from a man who had lost everything. In the ruins of the home, investigators found explicit photos Josh had taken of his sons, evidence of sexual abuse. They also found journals, letters, and emails that confirmed what everyone had feared. Josh Powell had murdered Susan. He had killed her that December night, likely in their home, and disposed of her body in one of the abandoned mine shafts he had researched in the remote Utah desert. The aftermath of the tragedy was devastating. The 911 dispatcher, who failed to respond appropriately, was later fired after an internal investigation. Elizabeth Griffin Hall, the social worker who had tried desperately to save those boys, was traumatized. She filed a lawsuit against the state, arguing that she had been put in an impossible situation and that warning signs about Josh's mental state had been ignored. Chuck and Judy Cox, who had lost their daughter and now their grandsons, became advocates for domestic violence victims and for reforming the family court system that they believed had failed to protect their grandsons. To this day, Susan Powell's body has never been found. Her family holds out hope that one day, someone will discover her remains and bring her home. The case remains open, but the truth is clear. Susan Powell was murdered by her husband, a man consumed by control, obsession, and rage, enabled by a father whose own depravity knew no bounds. This story is not just about a woman who vanished. It's about the insidious nature of domestic abuse, the warning signs that are ignored, and the unimaginable evil that can lurk behind the facade of a normal suburban family. Susan Powell wrote in her journal that if anything happened to her, it would not be an accident. She knew. And tragically, she was right. Halloween. For most kids, it's the greatest night of the year. A night of pure magic, costumes, and collecting so much candy your parents will be rationing it until Christmas. But on October 31st, 1974, in the quiet suburb of Deer Park, Texas, one father turned this beloved tradition into a weapon. MrBallen tells the story of Ronald Clark O'Brien, the man who would forever be known as the Candyman, and the night he poisoned his own son for money. Ronald O'Brien was a 30-year-old optician living in Deer Park with his wife Daneen and their two children, 8-year-old Timothy and 5-year-old Elizabeth. To his neighbors, Ronald seemed like a perfectly normal family man. He was tall, clean-cut, wore thick framed glasses that gave him an intellectual appearance, and he had a pleasant, charming demeanor. He sang in the church choir at the Second Baptist Church of Pasadena, was active in the community, and appeared to be a devoted father who doted on his children. His wife Daneen was a homemaker who took care of their two young children in their modest single-story home. From the outside, they looked like the perfect American family living the suburban dream. But behind this carefully constructed facade of suburban normalcy, Ronald was drowning in a sea of debt and desperation. Ronald O'Brien was a failure in every sense of the word. In the 10 years leading up to Halloween, 1974, he had held 21 different jobs, unable to keep any of them for long. He was fired from positions as an optician, a projectionist, and various other roles for incompetence, theft, and constant tardiness. He would borrow money from colleagues and never pay it back. He wrote bad checks that bounced repeatedly. He was chronically late on every bill, every payment, every financial obligation. By October 1974, Ronald was over $100,000 in debt, the equivalent of about $640,000 in today's money. He owed thousands to multiple creditors. His house was about to be foreclosed on, and his car was on the verge of being repossessed. Collection agencies called his home constantly. He was being threatened with lawsuits from multiple directions. His wife had no idea how bad things had gotten because Ronald had hidden the extent of their financial ruin from her. But Ronald had a plan. It was a plan so dark, so monstrous, that it would shock the entire nation. In the months leading up to Halloween, 1974, 974, Ronald began taking out life insurance policies on his children. He purchased policies from multiple companies, using different agents so no single person would realize the total amount of coverage he was accumulating. By October, he had over $60,000 in life insurance policies on Timothy and Elizabeth, with himself listed as the sole beneficiary. Some of these policies had been purchased as recently as January of that year. Others were taken out mere weeks before Halloween. Ronald even called insurance companies to ask specific questions about how quickly beneficiaries typically receive payouts after a death, and whether there would be any delays if the death was accidental versus natural causes. These calls would later become crucial evidence against him. On Halloween night 1974, Ronald took Timothy and Elizabeth trick-or-treating, along with two neighborhood friends, 10-year-old Mark Bates and 11-year-old Mark Donahoe, and Mark Donahoe's father, Jim Bates. The group met up around 7 o'clock in the evening as the sun was setting, casting long orange shadows across the suburban streets. The children were excited, their pillowcases and plastic pumpkin buckets ready to be filled with candy. Timothy was dressed as a Planet of the Apes character, his favorite movie at the time. Little Elizabeth wore a cheerful costume, and the neighborhood children were dressed in the typical assortment of ghosts, witches, and superheroes. The fathers walked behind the group of children as they ran excitedly from house to house, their voices ringing out in the traditional chorus of "Trick or Treat." They walked through the darkening streets of Deer Park, stopping at house after house. The evening was cool, but pleasant, perfect weather for trick-or-treating. At around 9 o'clock, they approached a house that had its porch light on, indicating the residents were participating in Halloween. The children ran up to the door and rang the doorbell. They waited. They rang again, but no one answered. The porch light was on, but the house was dark inside and completely silent. After a minute or two, the group gave up and moved on to the next house, the children already forgetting about it. But Ronald lingered behind. Jim Bates, who was walking with the group, noticed that Ronald had fallen back and was no longer with them. When Ronald caught up with the group a few minutes later, he was carrying 5 pixie sticks, those long paper tubes filled with colorful, sweet, and sour powder that kids loved in the 1970 seconds. These particular pixie sticks were 21 inches long, much larger than the typical ones you'd find in a store. Ronald told the group that he had gone back to that house where no one had answered, and this time a man had cracked open the door without turning on any lights. According to Ronald's story, this mysterious man had wordlessly handed him 5 giant pixie sticks through the barely open door. Ronald said he only saw the man's arm, which he described as hairy, reaching out from the darkness of the house to hand him the candy. The man said nothing, gave him the candy, and closed the door. It was a strange story, but in the excitement of Halloween night, no one thought much of it. Ronald said the man must have been busy or shy about his appearance. He distributed the pixie sticks, giving one to Timothy, one to Elizabeth, one to 10-year-old Mark Bates, and one to 11-year-old Mark Donahoe. He saved the 5th one to give to a boy from his church later. When they returned home around 9:30 in the evening, the children dumped their candy on the floor and began sorting through their treasures. The annual ritual of separating the good candy from the disappointing candy. Timothy was tired but happy, his pillowcase filled with chocolates, gum, and various sweets. He asked his father if he could eat some of his candy before bed. Most parents would say, "No, it's late. You've had enough sugar. Brush your teeth and get to bed." But Ronald not only said yes, he specifically encouraged his son to eat the pixie sticks. He told Timothy it was a special treat, a really good one that he should eat right away. Timothy grabbed the giant pixie sticks and tried to open it, but he couldn't. The top had been stapled shut with heavy-duty staples, which was very unusual. Pixie sticks came sealed at the factory with crimped paper ends, not staples. Ronald took the tube from his son and helped him open it, tearing away the staples at the top. Timothy poured the powder into his mouth. Within seconds, his face contorted. He began complaining that the candy tasted bitter and strange, not sweet like it was supposed to. He told his father something was wrong with it, that it tasted terrible. Ronald quickly got him a glass of Kool-Aid to wash away the taste, telling him to drink it fast. Timothy gulped down the drink and then went upstairs to brush his teeth and get ready for bed. His mother, Daneen, was downstairs. Minutes later, she heard a horrible sound coming from the bathroom. It was a sound no parent should ever have to hear, a gasping, choking, convulsing sound. She ran upstairs to find her son, lying on the floor of the bathroom. Timothy was convulsing violently, his small body racked with spasms. Foam was pouring from his mouth. He was vomiting and gasping desperately for air, his eyes wide with terror and confusion. Daneen screamed for Ronald. They called an ambulance, and Ronald began performing CPR on his son. But Timothy's lips were already turning blue. The ambulance arrived within minutes and rushed Timothy to the hospital. But by the time they reached the emergency room, 8-year-old Timothy O'Brien was dead. He had died less than an hour after eating the pixie sticks his father had given him. The cause of death was not immediately clear. The doctors were baffled. The boy had been perfectly healthy. He had no known allergies, no medical conditions. He had simply eaten some Halloween candy and collapsed. They suspected poisoning, but they needed to wait for toxicology results. The autopsy would reveal the horrifying truth. The pixie sticks that Timothy had eaten was laced with a massive dose of potassium cyanide, enough to kill 3 full-grown adults. Someone had opened the top 2 inches of the 21-inch candy tube, carefully poured out the original powder, replaced it with pure cyanide, and then resealed it with staples to hide the tampering. Whoever had done this knew exactly what they were doing. This was not a random act. This was premeditated murder. The police immediately began investigating, and their focus quickly turned to the story Ronald had told about the house where he claimed to have received the candy. Ronald was cooperative, even helpful. He volunteered to take the police to the house and help them identify it. But there was a problem. Ronald led police to the home 3 separate times over the course of the investigation, and each time he pointed to a different house. He seemed confused about which house it had been, despite the fact that it had only been a few days since Halloween. Finally, they settled on a specific home. The house belonged to a man named Courtney Melvin, an air traffic controller at William P. Hobby Airport. Police interviewed Melvin and investigated his background thoroughly. But Melvin had an ironclad alibi. Over 200 people, including his supervisor, co-workers, and time-stamped records, confirmed that Courtney Melvin had been at work at the airport from the afternoon of October 31st until 11 o'clock that night. He had been in the control tower managing air traffic during the exact time trick-or-treaters would have been at his house. He couldn't possibly have been the one who gave Ronald the candy. In fact, Melvin's house had been completely dark on Halloween night because no one was home. He and his wife didn't participate in Halloween that year specifically because they knew they'd both be at work. The mysterious, hairy-armed man who handed out poison in the dark didn't exist. Ronald had made him up. As detectives dug deeper into Ronald's life, they discovered a financial motive so obvious it was shocking. Ronald had recently taken out multiple life insurance policies on both of his children, totaling over $60,000, an enormous sum in 1974. Some of these policies had been purchased in January, others in the spring, and some as recently as just weeks before Halloween. Ronald had also made multiple phone calls to insurance companies in the weeks before Halloween, asking very specific questions about payouts, about how quickly beneficiaries receive money, about whether there would be investigations or delays, and about whether the payout would be the same if the death was accidental versus natural. These calls had been logged and recorded by the insurance companies. The police were able to recover the other 4 pixie sticks that Ronald had distributed that Halloween night. None of the other children had eaten theirs, which undoubtedly saved their lives. 10-year-old Mark Bates had been unable to open the heavy staples and had set it aside. 11-year-old Mark Donahoe's parents had thrown it away before he could eat it. Elizabeth's was found still in her trick-or-treat bag, unopened. The 5th pixie sticks, which Ronald had given to a boy from church, was also recovered. When police tested all 5 tubes, they found that every single one had been tampered with in the exact same way. All 5 had been opened, emptied, filled with lethal doses of potassium cyanide, and resealed with staples. This meant that Ronald's plan had been to kill multiple children to make it look like the work of a random madman, a Halloween psychopath who was randomly poisoning candy. But only Timothy, Ronald's own son, the one with the life insurance policies, had been specifically encouraged by his father to eat the candy before bed. When police investigated where the cyanide had come from, they discovered that Ronald had been asking colleagues and acquaintances about where to buy cyanide in the weeks before Halloween. He had told people he needed it to kill rodents at work. One chemical supply company confirmed that a man matching Ronald's description had inquired about purchasing potassium cyanide, but had not completed the transaction when told he would need to fill out paperwork and provide identification. The most damning testimony came from Ronald's own family members. His sister-in-law and brother-in-law told police something that made their blood run cold. They said that on the day of Timothy's funeral, while the family was still grieving, while Daneen was sobbing over the loss of her child, Ronald had already begun talking casually about the insurance money. He discussed how he would use the payout to take a long vacation, buy a new car, and purchase luxury items. He seemed not grief-stricken, but excited about his sudden windfall. His wife, Daneen, shattered his defense when she testified at trial. She told the court that Timothy had not chosen the pixie sticks on his own, or asked for it specifically. Ronald had specifically selected it from Timothy's candy bag and insisted that his son eat it right away before bed, which was completely out of character. She also testified that Ronald had seemed strangely calm and unsurprised when Timothy collapsed, and that his performance of CPR had seemed almost theatrical, like he was going through the motions for show. The evidence was overwhelming. Ronald Clark O'Brien had murdered his own 8-year-old son in cold blood for insurance money, using Halloween as his cover. He had tried to make it look like the work of a random madman, exploiting every parent's worst fear about poisoned Halloween candy to disguise his own monstrous crime. His plan had been to kill multiple children to disguise his true target, his own flesh and blood, the boy who called him daddy and trusted him completely. On June 3rd, 1975, it took a jury only 46 minutes to find Ronald O'Brien guilty of capital murder and 4 counts of attempted murder. He was sentenced to death. During his time on death row at the Ellis Unit in Huntsville, Texas, he maintained his innocence, claiming he was the victim of the same urban legend he had tried to exploit. He even suggested that perhaps his son had somehow gotten the poisoned candy from someone else, despite all evidence pointing directly to him. But no one believed him. The evidence was too clear, the motive too obvious, the planning too deliberate. On March 31st, 1984, nearly 10 years after he murdered his son, Ronald Clark O'Brien was executed by lethal injection at the Texas State Penitentiary in Huntsville. Outside the prison, a crowd of 300 people gathered, many of them wearing Halloween costumes in a macabre display. Some people were handing out pixie sticks to reporters in a grim celebration of justice. People carried signs that read "Trick or Treat" and counted down the final minutes of his life. When Ronald was pronounced dead at 12:48 a.m., the crowd outside erupted in cheers. Ronald O'Brien's crime had a lasting impact that reached far beyond his own family and changed American culture forever. Before 1974, stories of poisoned Halloween candy were just that. Stories. Urban legends, with no basis in reality. Parents would tell children to be careful, but it was mostly superstition. There had never been a verified case of a stranger randomly poisoning Halloween candy. But after Timothy O'Brien's murder, those fears became real. Parents across America began inspecting their children's candy with paranoid intensity. Hospitals started offering free X-ray services on Halloween night to check treats for hidden razors or needles. Many neighborhoods began organizing supervised trick or treating events in community centers instead of door-to-door visits. Some communities banned trick or treating altogether. The carefree innocence of Halloween in America was forever changed. Ronald O'Brien earned a nickname that would outlive him and become part of true crime folklore: the Candyman. And more specifically, the man who killed Halloween. The most horrifying part of this story is not that it happened on Halloween, or that it involved poisoned candy, or even that the victim was a child. The most horrifying part is that the monster in this story was not a stranger lurking in the shadows, not some unknown predator taking advantage of the holiday's chaos. The monster was a father who looked his own son in the eye, helped him open a piece of candy he knew was filled with poison, watched him eat it, and then acted surprised when the poison did exactly what he knew it would do. Timothy O'Brien trusted his father completely, the way all children trust their parents. He had no reason not to, and that trust, that pure, innocent trust, was repaid with murder. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is there, because time matters on this road. If you like your stories strange, dark, and mysterious, you're in the right place. Tonight we're headed to a flat slice of America where the sky feels too big and the land doesn't give you much to hold on to western Ohio into eastern Indiana. Cornfields, drainage ditches, a turnpike that runs so straight it feels like a decision you made hours ago and can't take back. Out here there's an exit people talk about in the way you talk about a bad dream, trying to be casual, failing. By daylight, it isn't there. No ramp, no sign, no merge lane. But after midnight, when the temperature drops and the road hum settles into your bones, a green rectangle appears in your high beams. Exit 41B, white letters. Arrow right. The locals call it Lost Prairie. The map doesn't. Our story follows a woman named Jordan Pike, 30, night shift nurse. Strong stomach, steady hands, the kind of person who can talk a stranger through a panic attack with just a voice and a cup of water. She was coming home from a double at the county hospital, eyes sandy, scrubs smelling like disinfectant and old coffee. It was 2:06 a.m., an hour she knew well. The turnpike was empty except for the occasional semi whispering past like a thought you weren't ready to have. A patch of fog slid across the asphalt. Then another. Jordan turned off the podcast she wasn't hearing anyway. The radio clicked, scanned, found nothing but a weather station murmuring about a temperature inversion and localized ground haze. She cracked her window. Cold air pushed in, heavy with cut hay and something sweeter, like fruit that's 2 days past ripe. The first sign appeared so gradually it felt like it had been there the whole time. Exit 41B, Lost Prairie, 1 mile. Jordan frowned. She knew this stretch. She knew every diner, every billboard for fireworks and fireworks attorneys. She did not know Lost Prairie. It was all fields out there, a fence line, a row of windbreak trees leaning the same way year after year. Half a mile later, another sign. White arrow. Services icons. Gas. Food. Lodging. You don't exist, she said to no one, half laughing at herself. She could have used the gas, though. Quarter tank. Enough. Probably. The next real exit was 12 miles east. She told herself she would pass it. She told herself she was tired, that brains invent things when they're low on glucose and lower on sleep. And then the ramp appeared on the right shoulder, widening, guardrail gleaming, that polite slope down into dark. Jordan signaled because that's who she is. She took the ramp. The turnpike fell away behind her with a long exhale. At the bottom, she met a stop sign that reflected too hard. The letters were too clean, like no bug had ever decided to die there. Ahead, a 2-lane cut east-west. To the right, a gas station glowed white and silent. A small motel squatted beside it. Single story, doors painted that particular tan only motels believe is comforting. A diner with a chrome smile was set back from the road, open, flickering in red, as if someone was pinching the wire. Jordan turned toward the light. The gas station looked like a stage set. Pumps wrapped in plastic that wasn't torn, just loose. The credit card screen on pump 3 displayed a blinking cursor that never advanced. The clerk's area was stocked and empty, the sort of empty that says, "I'll be right back," and then never is. Jordan walked to the door and tried it. Locked. She cupped one hand to the glass and looked in. A handwritten sign leaned against the register, the paper browned at the edges. "Back in 10. "Sure," she said softly. She checked her phone. 1 bar, then none. The clock ticked from 2:12 to 2:12. She could have left. Should have. The tank would make 12 miles. The turnpike was a left and a right away. Simple as heartbeat. But the diner's neon winked at her again, and she realized her hands were shaking. Food would fix that. Coffee would fix the rest. The diner door opened on the first push, little bell clearing its throat. Inside, everything wore a thin frosting of time, sugar shakers filmed over, a pie case holding 3 perfect slices that looked printed. The air smelled like warm toast and old pennies. A man stood behind the counter in a white shirt with a name tag that said LYLE in clean block letters. He wasn't young or old. He was the age of a thought you've had too many times. "Kitchen's still hot," he said, like they'd been talking. "Sit wherever." Jordan picked the end of the counter. It felt good to sit. The stool sighed. Lyle poured coffee without asking. The cup steamed like it was trying to say something. "Rough night?" he asked. "Long," she said. "I'm sorry. What town is this?" "I know the turnpike pretty well." Gottly. Lyle smiled a little, like he'd been waiting for the question all night. "Lost Prairie," he said. "You're safe here." That last part didn't sound like comfort. It sounded like permission. A woman in a corner booth looked up then, hair tied in a scarf, hands around her mug like she was holding a sleeping bird. She had the expression of someone listening to a song only she could hear. Behind her, the motel sign blinked in the window's reflection, and in the blink, its letters rearranged themselves into nothing, just red worms on glass. "What's good?" Jordan asked, because asking normal questions makes reality behave. "It usually does." "Grilled cheese," Lyle said. "Tomato soup. Or pie. It's all warm." "Soup," she said. "And do you have quarters?" The motel sign said laundry. "And I need..." She trailed off. She didn't need laundry. She just wanted to ask for the coin. The impulse came the way you sometimes want to pat a dog you don't know. Lyle slid 2 quarters across the counter. They were colder than the coffee mug. "We trade square here," he said. "You can settle up before you go." Jordan picked up 1 quarter. On the obverse, Washington wore a nick across his jaw like a pale scar. She didn't recognize the state on the reverse. The outline looked like a mistake. "Where's everybody?" she asked. "Seems quiet." "Depends when you ask," Lyle said. "You coming off the pike?" "Yeah." Lyle nodded like that meant something. "Road's been hungry," he said. "Fog pulls people sideways. You found the right place to step out of it." The soup came the right red, steam curling, a skin forming and breaking like a memory. Jordan ate. The heat steadied her. Lyle didn't hover. The woman in the booth hummed without opening her mouth. At some point, Jordan realized the coffee didn't cool. It stayed at that first sip temperature no matter how long she let the conversation, and the spoon tricked the clock. She checked her phone again. 2:12. Again. 2:12. "Can I ask you something weird?" she said. Lyle tipped his head. "How do I get back on the turnpike?" The question sounded too heavy. She felt suddenly stupid for asking it. Like asking a lake how to be less wet. "Same way you came," Lyle said. "Left at the light, up the ramp. But don't look at the sign. Let it look at you. And when you merge, don't check your mirrors right away. The road doesn't like to be watched." "Leaving. That's weird," he finished for her. "Yeah." Jordan paid. The quarters clinked against the counter and sounded like they'd dropped too far. She stood. The bell at the door cleared its throat again as she left. Outside, the fog had thickened. Shapes moved in it, not bodies. Exactly. Suggestions. The motel's doors were all closed. In the office window, A TV blued the blinds with a show that had no sound and no cuts. She got in her car. The engine turned like it had been sleeping lighter than she had. At the intersection, the light was red. No cross traffic, no wind, just red, and the fog moving like breath on glass. Jordan waited. The red was not going to turn. When it felt like a dare, she looked down at her lap and counted slowly. 1, 2, 3. When she looked up, the light was green. The ramp rose like a dark throat. The turnpike flowed above, white lines pulsing, semis moving like planets that forgot you. She merged, eyes forward, hands soft on the wheel. For a second, only a second, she almost checked her mirror. That's the moment the urge is strongest, when the danger feels like it's already gone. She kept her eyes ahead. She breathed out. The coffee in her chest finally cooled. 10 miles later, she let herself glance to the right, where the shoulder meets the weeds. No ramp. No sign. A gap in the fence line that might have been anything. The fog thinned. The temperature lifted a degree. The radio found a song she used to love and hadn't heard in years. Her phone woke up and scolded her with notifications. She laughed then, out of nothing but relief. It came out like a hiccup and made her eyes water. At home, she slept like she'd been dropped. When she woke at noon, the quarters were on her kitchen counter where she didn't remember putting them. She picked one up. It wasn't cold anymore. It was room temperature, coin temperature, forgettable. But when she flipped it over, the state outline had decided what it was. Ohio, of course. And yet there, in the outer ring of text, between United and States, a hairline crack that formed a tiny, narrow sliver. Like a ramp you only see if you stop trying to. Jordan went back over the next few weeks. In daylight, exit 41B was just nothing. Corn, a fence, the suggestion of a dip where rainwater collected if the wind was right. At night, she avoided that stretch, without deciding to. When coworkers asked why she took the long way home, she said construction, or deer, or boredom. You don't talk about a place like that unless you know the person hearing you won't try to go see it for themselves. People will tell you America is all mapped, that there are no blank spaces left, only smaller and smaller unknowns squeezed into the drainage ditches of the interstate. That's true, mostly. But some exits aren't for everyone. They're for the ones the road would like to keep, just for a minute, until the fog decides it's bored of you. If you find yourself out there after midnight, if the green rectangle blooms ahead, where there isn't supposed to be anything, if your dashboard clock decides this minute is worth repeating, here's how you pass through. Take the ramp like you meant to. Warm your hands around a coffee that refuses to cool. Pay for something simple with something small. When you go, don't look back too soon. Let the road do the leaving. And later, when you empty your pockets and a coin feels colder than it should, don't throw it out. Some places don't want your fear. They want your manners. And if you ever hear somebody at a truck stop ask where Lost Prairie is, just shake your head and say you haven't seen it in years. Then finish your coffee and go while the light is green.
He woke up and realized someone had tucked him in. The small one-bedroom apartment on the edge of downtown Chicago was everything Alex needed. A cozy space, a view of the skyline, and the comforting anonymity of a bustling city. He was a creature of habit, a man who lived a solitary and predictable life. He worked long hours as a data analyst, and his evenings were a quiet rhythm of takeout, a good book, and a sound sleep. His bed was his sanctuary, a place of peace and rest after a long day of numbers and spreadsheets. He was a man who believed in facts, in data, and in the tangible world. The first time it happened, he woke up with a start, a familiar cold chill running through him. He was covered in a way he wasn't before. His comforter, which he always just pulled up to his waist, was now tucked neatly under his chin, the sides folded firmly under the mattress. It was a perfect, deliberate tuck. He sat up, his heart pounding. The room was dark, the blinds were closed, and there was no one there. He told himself he had done it in his sleep, a weird, subconscious action. He was a single man. There was no other explanation. He was just tired. He pulled the covers off, untucked the corners, and went back to sleep. The next morning, it happened again. The comforter was tucked neatly under his chin, the sides firmly secured. This time, he was more than just confused. He was unsettled. He lived alone. The door was locked, the windows were sealed. He had no pets. He spent the entire day at work in a state of unease, his mind replaying the image of the perfectly tucked blanket. He couldn't shake the feeling of an unseen presence in his bedroom. That night, he decided to do something about it. He bought a motion-activated camera, a small, discreet one, and placed it on his nightstand, pointing directly at his bed. He wanted proof. He wanted to see himself, in the middle of the night, tucking himself in like a child. He went to bed, a cold, hard lump of dread in his stomach. He didn't sleep well. He woke up at every creak of the floorboards, every distant siren, convinced he would catch the culprit in the act. But he never saw anything. In the morning, he checked the camera footage. He fast-forwarded through the video, watching his sleeping form, the slow rise and fall of his chest. He watched for hours, his eyes glued to the screen. At 3:17 a.m., the camera's red light flickered on. He was sleeping soundly. The blanket was just over his waist, as he had left it. Then he saw it. A faint shadow, a fleeting ripple of air, seemed to pass over his bed. The comforter, without a single visible hand to guide it, slowly began to move. The sides folded under the mattress, a perfect tuck. The top of the comforter was pulled up, just to his chin. The motion was slow, deliberate, and silent. There was no one there. Just a shadow, a presence, a force that was tucking him in. Alex's breath hitched in his throat. He went back to the footage, watched it again and again, hoping it was a glitch, a trick of the light. But it wasn't. The motion was too fluid, too purposeful. It was an entity, a thing that was entering his room, not to scare him, not to harm him, but to perform a quiet domestic act. It was tucking him in. The terror of a monster was replaced by a more insidious, a more profound kind of fear. The fear of something that was a part of his life. A silent, unseen companion that watched him sleep and cared for him in its own chilling way. He couldn't stay in the apartment anymore. The feeling of being watched was too much to bear. He didn't tell his friends or family why he was moving. How could he explain that he was leaving his home because a ghost was tucking him in? He found a new place, a modern building with a doorman, a place where he was sure no one could get in. He meticulously checked every lock, every evening before he went to bed. He was determined to leave the terror behind. The first few nights were peaceful. He slept soundly, his dreams free of shadows and fear. He started to believe it was over, that he had finally escaped whatever had haunted him. But then, one morning, he woke up and noticed something strange. A faint, almost imperceptible circular impression on his pillow, as if a head had been rested there. He dismissed it. A crease in the pillowcase. The next morning, it was there again. And the morning after that, it was a silent message. A new kind of tuck. He began to research the history of his old apartment building. He went to the city archives, poring over old documents and newspaper clippings. He found a story, a small, almost forgotten article from a local newspaper in the 1920s. A woman named Clara had lived in his old apartment. She was an elderly seamstress who lived alone. She was known for her kindness and her love of her small, cozy home. The article mentioned that she had died in her sleep, a peaceful death. The last person to see her had said that she had a strange habit of tucking in her guests even when they were asleep. She believed it was a way of showing care, a quiet, gentle act of love. Alex felt a cold dread so complete it was a physical weight. Clara, the seamstress who had lived in his apartment, she hadn't left. She was still there, in the quiet, empty space, performing her small act of care. She wasn't a monster. She was a ghost who had chosen him, a lonely ghost who was just trying to be a good host. The thought was somehow more terrifying than any demon or ghoul. The ghost of a lonely seamstress who wanted to be his friend. He couldn't go back to the old apartment. He had left her. He had abandoned her. Her simple, kind act of tucking him in. He felt a profound sense of guilt. He had feared her, run from her, when all she had wanted was to care for him. He sat in his new, modern apartment, a city of millions around him, and felt more alone than ever before. He thought of Clara, of the lonely ghost in the old apartment. still waiting, still watching. He decided to go back. He had to. He had to apologize. He had to let her know he wasn't afraid. He went to the old building, a key in his pocket that he had never returned. He went up the 3 flights of stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. He unlocked the door to his old apartment, and he walked in. The apartment was empty, cold, and quiet. He went to his old bedroom, the place where the tucking had happened. The room was just as he had left it, the bed stripped bare. He went to his old nightstand, the place where he had put the camera. He sat on the floor, his back against the wall, and he spoke. "I'm sorry, Clara," he whispered into the empty room. "I'm so sorry. I didn't understand." The air grew heavy. The scent of lavender, faint and old, filled the room. He felt a sudden, profound sense of peace. The cold was gone. The fear was gone. He felt a gentle, loving presence. He didn't know if she was there, but he knew she had heard him. He had finally given her the acknowledgement she had so desperately sought. He had apologized. He left the apartment, closing the door behind him, and he didn't look back. He felt a sense of closure, of peace. He had done the right thing. He had faced his fear, and he had found a kind of forgiveness. He was a man who had been haunted, and now he was a man who was free. He went back to his new apartment, to his new life, and for the first time in a very long time, he slept soundly. He was no longer afraid of the dark or of the quiet. He was no longer afraid of being alone. He had faced his greatest fear, and he had found a kind of love in it. But some things are not that simple. The next morning, he woke up with a start. The comforter was tucked neatly under his chin, the sides folded firmly under the mattress. It was a perfect, deliberate tuck. He sat up, his heart pounding. The room was dark, the blinds were closed, and there was no one there. He looked at the comforter, at the perfect, impossible tuck. The ghost of Clara had followed him. She hadn't wanted to be left behind. She was still with him, in his new apartment, in his new life, a silent, unseen companion. The fear returned, a familiar, cold dread. He had apologized. He had tried to be a good man. But he had been a man who had been chosen, and a ghost who has chosen you will never let you go. The quiet, gentle terror of the tucking would be a part of his life forever. The tucking was a daily occurrence now. It became part of his routine. He would go to bed, leave his covers untucked, and in the morning they would be perfectly folded. It was a constant, unsettling reminder of his unseen companion. He no longer felt fear, but a weary acceptance. It was a part of his life, a strange, impossible roommate. He would find other small signs of her presence. The faint scent of lavender when he walked into his bedroom, a single loose thread on his pillowcase, as if she were a seamstress still at work. He tried to live a normal life, but the secret of his nocturnal visitor was a heavy weight on his soul. He started to talk to her. He would lie in bed in the dark and whisper into the silence. He would tell her about his day, about his work, about the new coffee shop he had found. It was a strange, one-sided conversation, but he felt a sense of connection, a strange companionship with the ghost of a lonely seamstress. He wasn't just a man who was haunted. He was a man who was no longer alone. But the companionship was not without its own brand of terror. Sometimes he would wake up, and the blankets would not be tucked. Instead, they would be pulled down to his feet, and he would feel a cold, icy presence on his chest. It was a new kind of tuck, a new kind of terror. It was a warning, a reminder that she was not just a kind old woman, she was a ghost. And ghosts are not always kind. One morning, he woke up, and he was not just tucked in. He was wrapped tightly in the blanket, his arms and legs bound to his body. He struggled to get free, his heart pounding with a primal, suffocating fear. He heard a soft whisper, a voice that was not in his ears, but in his mind. "Stay a while. I'm lonely." He finally managed to get free, his body shaking with terror. The blankets were perfectly wrapped, a tight, impossible cocoon. He looked at his reflection in the mirror, and he saw a man who was no longer just a tenant. He was a possession. Clara was not just a companion, she was a captor. He fled the apartment, ran out into the city streets, a man who had lost his mind. He found a friend, a man who had always been a skeptic, and he told him everything. The ghost, the tucking, the whispers. His friend listened, his face a mask of concern. He tried to be supportive, but the look in his eyes told a different story. He believed that his friend had gone crazy. Alex knew he couldn't go back. He couldn't go back to the apartment, to the woman who was trying to love him to death. He lived on the streets for a week, sleeping in parks and bus stations, a man with no home, no peace, no sanity. He was a fugitive from a ghost. One night, he was huddled in an alley, the cold Chicago wind biting at his skin. He felt a soft hand on his shoulder. He looked up, and he saw a woman. She was an old woman with a kind face and gentle eyes. She was holding a blanket. "You must be cold," she said, her voice soft and full of concern. She put the blanket around him, and gently, carefully, she tucked him in. He looked at her, and he saw a face that was both familiar and alien. It was the face of Clara. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The woman smiled, a kind, loving smile. She sat down next to him, and she began to talk. She told him about her life, about her home, about her love for her work. She talked, and he listened. A man who was no longer alone, he was with his ghost. She had followed him, she had found him, she had never let him go. The tucking was not just a gesture of care, it was a shackle, a promise that he would be hers forever. The doorbell that only rang at 3:15 a.m. The house on Sycamore Street, in a quiet suburb of Denver, Colorado, was a perfect blend of modern comfort and classic charm. Its white picket fence, a meticulously manicured lawn, and a sleek gray exterior were a welcome sight for Julia, a successful software engineer. She had just bought the house, a single story with a sunroom that overlooked the mountains, and it was everything she had worked for. She was a woman who valued structure and logic, and the house, with its smart locks and automated lighting, felt like an extension of her own organized life. The first few weeks were idyllic. She spent her evenings in the sunroom, watching the sunset, her days filled with the quiet satisfaction of a life well earned. The house was calm, a haven of peace, until the night the doorbell rang. It was 3:15 a.m. Julia was a light sleeper, and the sound of the chime, a classic ding-dong that echoed through the silent house, sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding. Who would be at her door at this hour? She crept out of bed, her phone in her hand, and checked the security camera feed. Her porch was empty. No one. The motion sensor hadn't been triggered, and the camera log showed no activity. It was a phantom chime. She went to the front door, peered through the peephole, and saw only the dark, empty street. She went back to bed, her mind racing, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. The next night, it happened again. 3:15 a.m. The same ding-dong. She sprang out of bed, checked the camera, and found nothing. This time, a cold dread replaced her initial surprise. This was not a fluke, it was a pattern. She started to dread the night, the clock ticking closer and closer to the appointed hour. She would sit up in bed, her eyes fixed on the digital display, waiting for the sound that was both impossible and terrifyingly real. She tried everything to stop it. She disabled the smart doorbell, unplugged the chime, and even went as far as to remove the button itself from the wall. The house was silent, dark, and empty. She went to bed, a profound sense of relief washing over her. She would finally get some rest. But at 3:15 a.m., the sound came again. It was faint this time, a ghostly echo of the chime, as if the sound itself had been imprinted on the house. It was not a physical sound. It was an auditory hallucination, a sound that was only for her. She began to spiral. The lack of sleep, combined with the psychological terror of the phantom chime, was taking its toll. Her work was suffering, her perfectly organized life was falling apart, and her friends started to notice her gaunt face and haunted eyes. She tried to tell them, but her words sounded crazy, even to her own ears. My doorbell keeps ringing, but there's no one there. They suggested she was stressed, that she was imagining it, but she knew she wasn't. The fear was too real. She tried to fight back with logic. She bought a new, more advanced security system. She installed infrared cameras and motion sensors all around the perimeter of her house. She even set up a camera inside the house, pointing at the front door, hoping to catch some glimpse of the impossible. She went to bed that night, a single, determined thought in her mind. She would find an answer. At 3:15 a.m., the faint, ghostly ding-dong echoed through her room. She sprang out of bed, grabbed her tablet, and checked the security camera feed. The outside cameras were still, the street was empty, and the motion sensors showed no activity. She switched to the inside camera, and her blood ran cold. The camera showed her front door, perfectly still and unremarkable. But as she watched, she saw a faint indentation appear on the surface of the wood, a small, circular impression, as if an invisible finger were pressing the now absent doorbell button. It was a phantom touch, a contact that was only visible to the camera's eye. The indentation lingered for a moment and then faded. The phantom chime had been the sound of an invisible visitor, an impossible presence that was trying to get into her house. Julia's mind reeled. This was not a hallucination. This was real. She was being haunted. But why? What did it want? She went back to the footage, pausing it, zooming in on the circular indentation. It was a perfect circle, a small, silent ring of pressure on her door. It was a persistent, patient, and terrifying attempt to get her attention. She had lived in this house for weeks, and this thing had been there all along, waiting for the opportune moment, for the dead of night, to announce its presence. She couldn't stay. She put the house on the market, desperate to escape the phantom chime and the invisible visitor. She packed her belongings with a frantic energy, throwing things into boxes without care. She just needed to be out. She needed to be gone before the next night. The house sold quickly, and she moved into a high-rise apartment in the city, a place with a doorman and security cameras on every floor. She felt a profound sense of relief as she settled in. The city noise was a comforting blanket, a constant, predictable sound that kept the silence at bay. She slept soundly for a week, and then two. She started to believe she had escaped. But some things can't be escaped. Sometimes a haunting is not about a place, it's about a person. One night, she was having a restless dream. A dream of a long, dark hallway and a ringing sound in the distance. She woke up with a jolt, her heart pounding. The clock on her nightstand read 3:15 a.m. A profound, icy coldness filled her room, seeping into her skin. She heard a sound, a faint, impossible ding-dong. It was not coming from her doorbell, it was coming from inside her phone. A ghostly echo, a notification sound she had never heard before. She looked at her phone. There was a notification on her calendar. It said, "Time to open the door." Her mind went blank with terror. It had followed her. It had found her. It was not the house. It was her. The doorbell wasn't meant for the house. It was meant for her. It was a silent, persistent knock on her soul, a plea for her to let it in. She looked at the door of her apartment, a solid, modern, locked door. She imagined the circular indentation on the surface of the wood, the invisible finger pressing against it, patiently waiting for her to respond. She knew she couldn't run anymore. This wasn't a problem she could solve with technology or logic. This was something ancient, something that had found her for reasons she couldn't fathom. She had to face it. That night, she made a decision. She would open the door. She sat in a chair in her living room, her eyes fixed on the clock on her phone. She felt the coldness, the familiar dread. The clock ticked closer to 3:15 a.m. She took a deep breath. She was a woman who valued structure and logic, and the most logical thing to do was to face the impossible. 3:15 a.m. The sound came, the faint, ghostly ding-dong, a sound that was not in her ears but in her mind. She stood up, her legs shaking, and walked to her front door. She took a deep breath, and with a hand that was surprisingly steady, she unlocked the deadbolt. She turned the knob and slowly, deliberately, pulled the door open. The hallway outside was empty. The lights were on, the cameras were on, and there was no one there. She felt a profound sense of confusion. She had expected a gaunt figure, a shadow, a presence. But there was nothing. The doorbell didn't ring again. She stood there for a long moment, looking at the empty hallway. She closed the door, locked it, and went back to bed. She slept soundly for the first time in months. She had faced her fear, and it had vanished. She woke up the next morning, feeling a sense of peace and liberation she had never known. She thought about the phantom chime, about the ghost that had haunted her. It was over. She was free. But some things are not that simple. As she was getting ready for work, she noticed something strange on her left hand. On her ring finger, a small circular impression, a faint, ghostly bruise, as if an invisible ring had been pressed onto her skin. She tried to rub it off, but it wouldn't fade. It was a permanent mark, a silent souvenir of the night she had opened the door. She looked at her hand, and she felt a sudden, deep sense of understanding. It wasn't about a door. It was about a commitment. She had invited it in. She had accepted its presence. The doorbell was not a request to enter. It was a symbol of a promise. She had been chosen. And the phantom chime had been the sound of an unseen ceremony. She was now bound to the thing that had haunted her, a partner in a haunting she had no memory of. And sometimes, when she's alone and the city is quiet, she looks at her hand, at the faint, circular bruise, and she hears it, a soft, gentle knock. A knock that is not a chime, but a promise. A knock that has followed her and will continue to follow her for the rest of her life. She is not just a homeowner anymore, she is a bride to a ghost. And the phantom chime was the sound of her wedding bells. Why his bedroom window was always unlocked in the morning. The apartment on the third floor of a pre-war brownstone in Brooklyn was a classic New York City find. High ceilings, hardwood floors that groaned with every step, and large windows that looked out onto a quiet, tree-lined street. For Ethan, a young architect, it was a dream. He had moved there for the space and the light, a welcome change from the cramped studio he had occupied for years. He meticulously arranged his furniture, set up his drafting table by the window, and settled into a life of predictable, quiet solitude. The first strange occurrence was so subtle he almost missed it. He was a creature of habit, and his morning ritual never varied. He would wake up, get a cup of coffee, and then go to his bedroom window to look at the street below. One morning, as he opened the blinds, he noticed his window was unlocked. He distinctly remembered locking it the night before. He was a stickler for security, a habit ingrained from years of city living. He shook his head, thinking he must have been tired, and locked it again. It happened the next day, and the day after that. Every morning, without fail, the window would be unlocked. He started to take it more seriously. He would double-check the lock before getting into bed. He would even take a picture of it with his phone, the lock firmly in place, the brass bolt slid securely into the frame. In the morning, he would check the photo and then look at the window. The photo would show the window locked, the window would be unlocked. He couldn't explain it. He was a rational man, a man who believed in cause and effect. He considered every possibility. Was it a draft? A faulty lock? He took the lock apart, cleaned it, and reassembled it. It worked perfectly. He even installed a secondary lock, a simple latch at the top of the window frame. He would lock both of them, and in the morning, both would be unlocked. It was a maddening, impossible reality. The feeling of dread began to seep into his life. He was no longer just annoyed, he was terrified. Someone or something was in his room every night. He couldn't shake the image of a gaunt, shadowy figure standing by his bed watching him sleep. He had no proof, no other evidence of an intrusion. The apartment was pristine in the morning. Nothing moved, nothing missing, just the open window. He bought a motion-activated camera, a small, discreet one that he placed on his dresser, pointing directly at the window. He was so nervous that night he barely slept, waking up at every creak of the floorboards. In the morning, he checked the camera. The video showed him getting into bed, the room falling silent. He fast-forwarded through the footage, watching himself sleeping peacefully. Then, at 2:47 a.m., he saw it. The camera's red light flickered on, the window was in the frame, and he saw, with a gut-wrenching certainty, the lock on the top latch slowly, silently slide out of place. A moment later, the main lock followed, the brass bolt retracting with an almost imperceptible click. The window itself did not move. It was as if an invisible hand had reached out and unlocked it. He watched, his heart pounding as the video continued. Nothing else happened. The room was still. The camera's light turned off and the video ended a few seconds later. Ethan's mind was a whirlwind of fear and disbelief. He had proof. There was a presence in his room, an entity that was not human that was unlocking his window every night. But why? What did it want? He looked at the video again, searching for any other sign, any other clue, but there was nothing. The room was a tableau of perfect silence and stillness. Just a window, unlocking itself. He couldn't stay in the apartment anymore. The feeling of being watched, of being vulnerable to an invisible intruder, was too much to bear. He called his landlord, told him he was breaking his lease, and began packing his belongings. He didn't tell his friends or family why. He didn't want to sound crazy. How could he explain that he was leaving his dream apartment because a ghost was unlocking his window? He found a new place, a modern high-rise in a different part of the city. The windows were new, made of reinforced glass, and the locks were mechanical marvels. He felt a sense of relief as he settled in, a feeling of security that he hadn't known in weeks. He meticulously checked every lock, every evening, before he went to bed. He was determined to leave the terror behind. The first week was peaceful. He slept soundly, his dreams free of shadows and fear. He started to believe it was over, that he had finally escaped whatever had haunted him. But then, one morning, he woke up and noticed something strange. A faint, almost imperceptible film of dust on his nightstand. He wiped it away, thinking nothing of it. The next morning, it was there again. And the morning after that, it was as if someone had run a single ghostly finger over the surface of the wood. Then, he found something in his bed. A small, black feather. It was impossibly thin, almost like a piece of ash, and it was nestled in his sheets, right by his pillow. He picked it up, his hand trembling. It didn't look like any feather he had ever seen. It was a cold, alien object. He was losing his mind. He was trying to find a rational explanation for irrational events. He was back in the same cycle of fear, the same cycle of disbelief. He went to the old apartment. The window was locked, just as he had left it. He looked up at his old room, at the large, beautiful window, a window that had become a source of profound terror. He wondered if his replacement had noticed the unlocked window in the morning. He decided to do more research. He went to the local historical society, a musty old building filled with the memories of the city. He looked through old records of his brownstone, tracing its history back to the 1800s. He found a story, a small, almost forgotten article from a local newspaper. A young boy, a child named Edward, had lived in the building in the late 1800s. The boy was an insomniac, a child who would stay up all night, sketching in his notebook, his mind filled with fantastic, impossible creatures. The boy had an obsession with the window. He would open it every night, regardless of the weather, and stare out into the darkness, claiming he was watching for something that was coming for him. The article ended abruptly, mentioning that the boy had died in his sleep, a sudden, unexplained illness. The last person to see him had said that he had insisted on his window being left unlocked, a plea that his parents had ignored. Leo felt a cold dread so complete it was a physical weight. The boy's room. It was his old bedroom. The boy had been looking for something, a creature from his drawings, and he had believed that leaving the window unlocked was his only hope. He had died and the window was locked. But what if the thing he was waiting for had finally come for him? And what if, in death, he was still waiting, still trying to open the window to let it in? He went home, his mind a feverish blur of fear and understanding. He looked at his modern, secure windows. He had left the old apartment, but the memory, the terror, the presence had followed him. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in a chair, watching the sunrise, a cold, hard knot of fear in his stomach. The next morning, he went to his bedroom, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked at the window. It was closed. He looked at the lock. It was locked. He felt a profound sense of relief. But then he saw it. A single, small, black feather on the windowsill. The same cold, impossible feather he had found in his bed. It wasn't just his old apartment that was haunted. He was. The entity, the thing Edward had been waiting for, had found him. It wasn't coming in through the window. It was already in. He called a locksmith, a friend of his who specialized in antique locks. He had a strange request. He wanted him to install an old, complicated, beautiful lock on his modern window. He wanted a lock that would be a challenge, a lock that would require skill and care to open. His friend, curious, asked him why. Leo just said he had a fascination with old mechanisms. The lock was installed. It was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, a brass lock with a complex series of tumblers and bolts. It was a statement, a challenge to the invisible intruder. He went to bed that night, a single black feather on his bedside table, a silent promise. He wasn't going to run anymore. He woke up with a start. The clock on his nightstand read 2:47 a.m. He looked at the window. It was still locked. He looked at his nightstand. The feather was gone. He felt a deep, profound sense of terror. It was no longer a game of unlocking windows. It was a game of possession. The entity was in his home, in his life, and it was moving his things, taunting him. The terror was no longer a silent presence. It was an active force. He spent the next few months living in a constant state of fear. He would come home to find objects moved, his keys on a different hook, his books in a different order. He would find these small black feathers in the most impossible places, in his coffee mug, in his shoe, in his pocket. The entity was toying with him, making him question his sanity. He would find notes on his computer, notes he didn't write, notes that said, "I'm here." He couldn't take it anymore. He had to confront it. He was a rational man, but he was at the end of his rope. He would do the impossible. He would leave his window unlocked. He would invite it in. He would face it. That night, he went to his bedroom window, his hands shaking, and he unlocked the intricate brass lock. He did the same to the old-fashioned latch on the top. He left the window open, just a crack, a silent invitation. He got into bed, a cold, hard lump of dread in his stomach. He didn't close his eyes. He waited. He waited for the cold, the shadow, the presence. He waited for the feather to appear. He waited for what felt like an eternity. Nothing happened. The sun began to rise, casting a pale glow into his room. He was exhausted, but he had no fear. He looked at his window. It was still unlocked. He looked at his nightstand. There were no feathers. He felt a profound sense of confusion. Had it all been a dream? Had he gone crazy? He got out of bed, a new question in his mind. Not why was his window unlocked, but why was it no longer unlocked? He walked over to the window, his mind racing. He looked out at the street below, at the people walking to work, at the world that was moving on without him. He looked at the window, and he saw a note. A small piece of paper, folded into a perfect square, was stuck to the glass. He opened the window and grabbed the note. It said, "It's too late. I'm already inside." He didn't run. He just stood there, the note in his hand, looking at his reflection in the glass. He saw a man who had lost his mind, a man who had invited a ghost into his home. He looked at his reflection, and he saw a single, small black feather in his hair. He looked at the note in his hand, and he felt a single, slow knock on the back of his head. A knock that he knew was not the wind, not a neighbor, not the house settling. It was the last goodbye. It was the last time he would ever feel alone. At 2:33 a.m., the knock came from inside the walls. The old Victorian house on Elm Street was a beautiful wreck. It had peeling paint, sagging porches, and a widow's walk that looked out over the entire town of Portland, Oregon. For Leo, a history professor and a restorer of antique furniture, it was a dream. He saw past the decay and imagined the stories the house could tell. He spent his life working on things that were old and broken, and this house felt like his greatest project yet. He bought it at a steal, and for the first few months, the creaks and groans of the old place were just the sounds of history settling in. The first strange event happened 3 weeks after he moved in. He was in his study, a room with a large bay window and walls lined with books, when he heard a sound. A quiet, rhythmic tapping. He thought it was a branch from the ancient oak tree outside, scratching against the window pane. He went to the window, opened it, and looked. The tree was still. The tapping stopped. He shrugged it off as a house noise and went back to his desk. The next night, it was louder. He was in the kitchen making tea when the tapping began again. It seemed to be coming from the wall behind the stove. He pressed his ear against the cold plaster. The sound was faint, but clear. It was a single, gentle knock. Knock. Then, a pause. Knock. He pulled back, a cold shiver running down his spine. It was a human sound, not a settling beam or a scurrying animal. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic. He told himself it was a neighbor, a prank, or maybe a pipe. But the knocking was too precise, too isolated to be a plumbing issue. He walked around the kitchen, tapping on different spots on the wall, trying to find the source. The knocking didn't respond, it simply stopped. The pattern became terrifyingly predictable. Every night, at precisely 2:33 a.m., the knocking would start. Sometimes it was faint, a gentle whisper from within the walls. Other times it was so loud it sounded like someone was trying to break through. It was always a single knock, followed by a pause, and then another single knock. It was a quiet, relentless, unsettling rhythm. He started keeping a journal. He would write down the time the knocking started, the duration, and its intensity. He'd write about the feeling it gave him, a deep, visceral dread. He began to anticipate it, his body tensing as the clock ticked past 2:30 a.m. He'd sit up in bed, his heart pounding, his eyes fixed on the walls, waiting for the sound that would tell him he was not alone. He tried to reason with himself. He was a man of science, a man who dealt in facts and logic. He brought in a contractor, an old man named Bill, who had worked on houses in the area for decades. Bill went from room to room, tapping on the walls, checking for loose plaster or water damage. He found nothing. "Old houses just make noises, son," he'd said with a shrug. But the look in his eyes told a different story. It was a look of weary recognition, a look that said he had seen things he couldn't explain. Leo couldn't escape it. The knocking became his personal clock. He'd fall into a deep sleep, only to be jolted awake by a sudden, sharp rap from within the walls. He started spending his nights in the living room, in a chair in the middle of the floor, far away from any walls. But even there, he could hear it. The sound would travel through the floorboards, through the air, finding him no matter where he was. It was a sound meant for him. He began researching the house's history. He went to the city archives, poring over old blueprints and property records. He found a strange note in the original deeds, a clause that mentioned a sealed-off room, a small 5-by-5-foot space between the pantry and the laundry room. It had been sealed up for reasons unknown, and the original owner had insisted it never be opened. The pantry and the laundry room, Leo's heart pounded in his chest. The knocking came from the wall that separated those two rooms. He felt a profound sense of dread. There was something in there, something that wanted out. He went to the laundry room, his flashlight in hand. He shined the light on the wall where the knocking was loudest. The wall was a seamless expanse of plaster. There were no cracks, no lines to indicate a hidden door, but as he ran his hand over the surface, he felt a faint, cold spot, a patch of wall that was colder than the rest. He pressed his ear against it. Nothing. The knocking would only come at 2:33 a.m. He waited for the clock to strike the appointed hour. He sat in the laundry room, his back against the opposite wall, his eyes fixed on the cold spot. He felt a deep sense of wrongness, of a hidden history screaming to be heard. The clock ticked closer. He held his breath. 2:32 a.m. The air grew heavy. The silence in the house was absolute. Even the gentle hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen faded into nothingness. 2:33 a.m. He heard it, a single, sharp knock. It came from the cold spot on the wall. It was not a gentle tap this time. It was a desperate, pleading sound, a voice without a mouth, trying to get his attention. Knock. Another one. Louder. Knock. He couldn't take it anymore. The mystery, the fear, the relentless rhythm had broken him. He went to his shed, grabbed a hammer, and returned to the laundry room. He didn't care about the history, the property value, or the original deeds. He just needed to know. He needed to make it stop. He took a deep breath, raised the hammer, and swung. The hammer hit the plaster with a dull thud. A small crack appeared. He swung again and again, the plaster shattering, revealing the lath and plaster beneath. He kept hitting, tearing the wall apart, until he hit a piece of wood. It was an old piece of wood, but it was solid. He hammered away at it, his arms aching, his mind a feverish blur of fear and determination. He kept going, until he had torn a hole big enough to see inside. He shined his flashlight into the darkness. The space was a small, dusty closet. There was a single small chair in the middle of the room. On the seat of the chair, sitting perfectly still, was a doll. It was a little boy doll, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, with porcelain skin and painted blue eyes. The doll was sitting in a pose that was eerily human. And on the floor next to the chair, there was a single small piece of paper. He reached in, his hand shaking, and pulled it out. It was a note, written in a child's shaky hand. It said, "I want to play." And mescrew, Leo dropped the paper and the flashlight. He stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The knocking stopped. The silence returned. It wasn't the silence of peace, but the silence of a predator who had found its prey. He had opened the door. He had let it out. He sold the house a month later. He didn't tell the new buyers about the hole in the wall, the sealed-off room, or the doll he had found. He couldn't. Who would believe him? He moved to a new city, to a modern apartment, with no history, no secrets, no hidden rooms. He got a new job, a new life. He was a man who had left his ghosts behind. But some things can't be left behind. Sometimes, at night, when the city is quiet and the moon shines through his window, he wakes up. His heart pounds, a cold chill running through his veins. He looks at the clock on his phone. 2:33 a.m. He looks at the wall of his new, modern, perfectly sealed apartment, and he waits, and he listens. And sometimes, just sometimes, he hears a single, gentle knock. A knock that he knows is not a pipe, not a neighbor, not the house settling. It is a knock that has followed him across a country, a knock that has found him in the quiet of the night, a knock that has come from inside the walls. And he knows with a terrifying certainty that he is not alone, and that he will never be. The quiet, relentless terror of the knocking continued to haunt him even in his new life. It was a mental tic, a phantom limb of fear that would never go away. He would wake up in a cold sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs, convinced he could hear it from the very core of his modern apartment building. His new life was a facade, a carefully constructed illusion of normalcy. He would go to work, talk to his colleagues, and eat dinner with new friends, but underneath it all, a part of him was always listening. He would find himself staring at blank walls, wondering if he could see the faintest of shadows moving behind the paint. He tried to fight back. He went to a therapist, a kind woman who listened to his story with a compassionate but skeptical ear. She suggested it was a manifestation of trauma, a psychological echo of the fear he had experienced. He went on medication, hoping to dull the edges of his anxiety. He tried meditation and mindfulness, anything to quiet the ceaseless, terrifying voice in his head. But the knocking was not in his head. It was a memory, a reality, a thing that had become a part of him. One night, he was out with friends. They were laughing, telling stories, and he felt a brief moment of freedom. He looked at his watch, 2:32 a.m. He felt the familiar rush of adrenaline, the icy chill. He excused himself, went to the bathroom, and splashed cold water on his face. He looked at his reflection in the mirror. His eyes were wide, and his face was gaunt, the face of a man who had not known a moment of true peace in months. He returned to the table, but he couldn't stop looking at his phone. 2:33 a.m. He felt the vibration first, a faint tremor, as if someone had just tapped the glass of his phone. He looked down at the screen. There was a text message, a new number, a number he didn't recognize. He opened it. "You left me alone!" He dropped the phone, his hands shaking. His friends looked at him, their laughter dying on their lips. "Leo, what's wrong?" one of them asked. He didn't answer. He just stared at the phone on the table, the terrible words glowing in the dim light of the restaurant. The knocking wasn't just in the walls. It was in the air, in the technology that connected him to the world. It had found a new way to reach him. He ran from the restaurant, ran through the dark streets of the city, the cold night air biting at his skin. He ran back to his apartment, slammed the door shut, and stood in the middle of his living room, his back against a wall. The knocking wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from his phone, from the computer, from the television. It was in the very wiring of his modern life. It had spread. He spent the next few days in a state of terror. He didn't answer his phone. He turned off his computer. He unplugged every electronic device in his apartment. He was living in a self-imposed isolation, a desperate attempt to cut off the source of the terror. He ate cold food, and he read books by candlelight. He told himself it was just a prank, a sick joke by a friend who had found his journal. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it wasn't. One night, the power went out. The entire city block was plunged into a sudden, absolute darkness. Leo sat in his living room, a single candle casting a dancing shadow on the walls. He felt a profound, unnerving silence. No hum of the refrigerator, no light from the street lamps, just him and the darkness. He felt a moment of hope, a desperate, flimsy belief that this was it, that the power outage had finally severed the connection. 2:33 a.m. He heard it. A single, sharp knock. It wasn't coming from his phone, or his computer, or the walls. It was coming from the window. He looked at the window, the faint outline of a child's hand visible against the glass. The hand was tapping, a slow, deliberate rhythm. The glass was not just tapping, it was a single, sharp knock, the knock that had followed him. It wasn't in the walls, it wasn't in the electronics, it was in the world. It was a reality. He was no longer a restorer of old things. He was a curator of a nightmare. He had opened the door, and the thing behind the walls had come out. It had followed him, and it would continue to follow him. He realized that the note in the closet, "I want to play," wasn't just a threat. It was an invitation, and he had accepted it, and now the game would never end. She checked her phone footage and saw herself awake. The small apartment in Austin, Texas, was a testament to Amelia's love for order. Every book on the shelf was alphabetized, the throw pillows on the couch were always perfectly fluffed, and the kitchen counters were perpetually clear. Her life was a carefully curated sequence of events, a calm and predictable rhythm. She was a freelance graphic designer, and her days were spent in the quiet company of her monitor, a cup of green tea, and her dog, a sleepy beagle named Barnaby. Her nights were a different story. For the past few weeks, sleep had become her enemy. She would wake up in the middle of the night, a profound and unsettling chill running through her, with no memory of what had disturbed her. The first few times, she dismissed it. A bad dream, a strange noise from a neighbor, the natural restlessness of a person under a bit of stress, but it started to happen every night. Always around 3:00 a.m. She would sit up in bed, wide awake, her heart pounding, her mind a blank slate. The strange awakenings started to take their toll. She was perpetually exhausted, her focus at work was suffering, and the lines of her carefully ordered life were beginning to blur. Her friends joked that she needed a sleep mask and some lavender oil. Her doctor suggested a change in diet and more exercise. Nothing worked. The sense of profound unease persisted. A cold, sharp dread that would hit her the moment her eyes opened in the pre-dawn darkness. One morning, she woke up with an idea. It was born of desperation and a need for proof. She would record herself sleeping. It was a simple solution. She would set up her phone on a small tripod at the foot of her bed, start the video recording, and in the morning, she would have her answers. Maybe she snored. Maybe she thrashed around in her sleep. Maybe a neighbor's loud music was the culprit. Anything was better than the quiet, terrifying unknown. The first night, she set up the phone, pressed record, and climbed into bed, feeling a strange mixture of relief and foolishness. She fell asleep quickly, the exhaustion finally winning the battle. She woke up at 3:07 a.m., just a few minutes later than her usual time. The same icy dread washed over her. She got up, stopped the recording, and went back to sleep. Her mind filled with a faint sense of disappointment that she had woken up again. The next morning, with a cup of coffee in hand, she sat down at her desk to watch the video. She fast-forwarded through the footage, watching her sleeping form, seeing the steady rise and fall of her chest, Barnaby curled up at her feet. She skipped ahead to the 3:00 a.m. mark. She watched herself stir in her sleep, her body tensing, and then her eyes snapped open, just as she remembered. She sat up in bed, her face a mask of fear. She watched herself look around the room, her head slowly turning from side to side. Then, she saw something else on the screen, something she hadn't seen in the moment. In the background of the shot, just by the open closet door, a shadow seemed to deepen. It was an unnatural movement, a thickening of the darkness. It was slow and deliberate, like someone stepping out from the shadows. She froze, a cold shiver racing down her spine. The figure was gaunt, tall, and dressed in a long dark coat. Its hands were impossibly long, the fingers like spidery branches. It took a step out of the closet and stood there, motionless, watching her sleeping form. The Amelia on the screen was looking at it now. She saw her head turn, her gaze fixed on the closet. But she didn't scream. She didn't move. She just sat there, a blank, terrified expression on her face, watching the thing in the darkness. The figure in the coat raised one of its long arms, and slowly, gently, it waved. A single, slow motion, like a farewell. Then it simply faded into the darkness, the space where it had been returning to normal. Just as the figure vanished, the Amelia on the screen shuddered, and her eyes, now filled with tears, looked down at her lap. A few seconds later, she reached for her phone, and the video ended. Amelia's mind was reeling. This was not a nightmare. This was real. She was not waking up on her own. Something was waking her up. Something that was waiting in her closet, watching her. She didn't know what it was. She didn't want to. She went back to the footage, pausing it, zooming in. The image was grainy, but the features were undeniable. The gaunt face, the impossibly long limbs, the dark coat. It was a thing of nightmares, come to life in her quiet, orderly apartment. She tried to rationalize it. A glitch in the camera? A trick of the light? But the movement was too fluid, too purposeful. It waved at her. She watched the motion again and again, her stomach churning with nausea and dread. She called a friend, but her words sounded crazy, even to her own ears. "I saw a monster on my phone," she said, her voice cracking. Her friend tried to be supportive, but she could hear the confusion and concern in her tone. She spent the next few days in a fog of fear. She couldn't sleep, she couldn't work. The fear was a constant, heavy presence. She went to the police. They listened patiently, their faces a mix of politeness and skepticism. They suggested she see a counselor. They told her there were no signs of a break-in, no evidence of anything amiss. She was on her own. She decided to try the video again. She knew it was a terrible idea, but the need for answers was a powerful and dangerous force. She was a woman who needed to understand, to organize, to label. The unknown was her greatest fear. She set up the phone again, her hands shaking, and got into bed, leaving a small lamp on this time. She couldn't bear to be in total darkness. She fell into a fitful sleep, her dreams a chaotic jumble of shadowy figures and long, spidery hands. She woke up, as always, at 3:00 a.m. Her eyes opened, and she felt the now familiar chill. She looked at the closet door. It was closed. She felt a brief moment of relief. Then she heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from inside her closet. A slow, gentle tapping, as if something were drumming its fingers on the back of the door. The sound was not loud, but it was so deliberate, so unnatural, that it was 1,000 times more terrifying than a scream. She watched the closet door, her eyes wide with fear. The tapping stopped. Then she heard a faint, scratching sound. It was coming from the floor, just beneath the door. She watched as a small, thin, black object slid out from under the door. It was a piece of paper, folded into a perfect square. It was pushed all the way out into the middle of the floor, and then the scratching sound stopped. She was too terrified to move, to breathe. She waited until the first light of dawn broke through her window. The terror had given way to a quiet, cold determination. She got out of bed, her body stiff with fear. She went to the paper and picked it up. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely unfold it. Inside, there was a single sentence, written in a spidery, unsettling script. "I miss our conversations." Her mind went blank. Conversations? What conversations? She didn't remember any conversations with a shadowy figure. The thought was horrifying. She had been awake. The video had shown her. But she had no memory of it. The thing in her closet was waking her up and speaking to her, and then somehow making her forget. It was more than a presence. It was a parasitic memory, a dark companion that was slowly, patiently stealing her waking hours. She ran. She didn't pack anything. She grabbed Barnaby, her keys, and her wallet, and she ran out of the apartment. She didn't stop to call anyone. She drove to the nearest motel, checked in, and sat on the bed in the middle of a brightly lit room, her phone footage playing on a loop. She watched herself, her sleeping self, a quiet, unsuspecting prey, and she watched the shadowy figure, a patient predator, waiting for her to wake up. She never went back to the apartment. She abandoned her furniture, her belongings, her carefully curated life. She moved to a new city, a place with a different time zone, where 3:00 a.m. was not 3:00 a.m. anymore. She installed security cameras throughout her new apartment, and she never, ever slept with her closet door closed. She started therapy, a long, difficult process of trying to understand the gaps in her memory and the nature of the fear that had become a constant companion. She learned about dissociative amnesia, about the mind's way of protecting itself from trauma, but she knew this wasn't just a psychological break. It was something else. Months turned into a year. She was beginning to heal. She had a new job, new friends, a new rhythm. The terror had receded, replaced by a quiet, lingering vigilance. The memory of the figure in the coat was a dull ache in the back of her mind, a scar from a wound that would never fully close. She still sometimes woke up in the middle of the night, a cold dread in her stomach, but she would check her phone, the time would be a random number, and the fear would subside. She told herself she was okay. She told herself she was safe. Then, one night, she was having a restless dream. A dream of a long, dark hallway and a gaunt figure waiting at the end. She woke up with a gasp, her heart pounding. The clock on her nightstand read 3:00 a.m. A profound, icy coldness filled her room, seeping into her skin. Barnaby, who was sleeping at the foot of her bed, suddenly sat up, his ears twitching, and he began to growl, a low, guttural sound. He was looking at the closet door. It was closed. A single, small piece of paper slid out from under the door, unfolding as it went. It was a perfect square. It came to rest in the middle of her floor. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked at Barnaby, and he was still growling, his eyes fixed on the paper. She was terrified, but a new feeling, a feeling she hadn't known before, was rising within her. It was a cold, quiet anger. This thing had stolen her peace, her home, her memories. It had chased her across states. She wasn't going to run anymore. She got out of bed, her legs trembling, but her resolve firm. She walked over to the paper, and with a hand that was surprisingly steady, she picked it up. She unfolded it and read the words, written in that same spidery, unsettling script. "You can't outrun me." She looked at the closet door. "I know," she whispered into the darkness, her voice filled with a strange new power. She crumpled the paper in her hand and threw it in the trash. She went back to her bed and lay down, her heart still pounding, but the fear was different now. It was no longer a terror that paralyzed her. It was a challenge. She had been a victim for too long. She had been running. But what would happen if she stood still? She didn't know. But she was finally willing to find out. She would stay in this apartment, she would find out what this thing was, what it wanted, and she would fight it. She wasn't going to let it steal another minute of her life. She looked at her phone, at her reflection in the dark screen. The woman staring back at her was still afraid. But she was no longer just a victim. She was a warrior. And for the first time in a very long time, she was finally home. She wasn't going to let the shadows win. The stranger who sat at the edge of her bed and vanished. The old farmhouse, set deep in the rolling hills of rural Ohio, was everything Eleanor had ever wanted. A wraparound porch for drinking coffee at sunrise, a stone fireplace that crackled with warmth on cold nights, and a sky so dark with no city lights that the stars looked like a spilled handful of diamonds. She had moved there to escape the relentless noise of her life, to find a stillness she hadn't known since childhood. For a year, the house was her sanctuary. Its creaks and groans were the comfortable sounds of a living, breathing structure. The silence was a blanket she could wrap herself in. Then, the quiet changed. It was subtle at first. A feeling of being watched when she was alone in the kitchen. A cold draft in the hallway, even with every window sealed tight. She brushed it off as an overactive imagination, a side effect of living so far from civilization. She told herself it was just the isolation settling in. But then, one night, she woke up with a start. The digital clock on her nightstand glowed 3:17 a.m. Her breath caught in her throat. She wasn't alone. Sitting at the very edge of her bed, his back to her, was a figure. A man. His posture was slumped, his shoulders bowed, as if the weight of the world was resting on them. He was dressed in what looked like an old, dark suit, frayed at the cuffs, and he was completely still. Eleanor was frozen, a statue of pure terror. She couldn't scream, couldn't move. Her mind raced, grappling with the impossible reality. How did he get in? The doors were locked. The windows were secured. She didn't own a dog, so there was no alarm to be triggered. He was just there. She squeezed her eyes shut and then opened them again. He was still there. The silence in the room was absolute, a vacuum where sound should be. She could hear the frantic beat of her own heart, a hummingbird trapped in her chest. She watched the figure, her eyes trying to make out his features, but he was just a silhouette against the faint moonlight filtering through the blinds. She could feel his presence, a cold, heavy weight in the air. He wasn't breathing, not in a way a living person would. There was no rise and fall of his shoulders, just a desolate, unmoving stillness. After what felt like an eternity, he began to move. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted one hand and rested it on the bed, just beside his leg. The fabric of the comforter didn't shift, but she felt a sudden, profound coldness radiating from the spot. It was like touching frozen steel. Then, just as slowly, he began to turn his head. Eleanor's breath hitched. She could see the profile of his face now. It was thin, gaunt, with an unnerving hollow where his eyes should have been. The other side of his face was lost in shadow. He was turning, slowly, agonizingly, to look at her. She felt an overwhelming dread, a primal fear that had nothing to do with a home invader and everything to do with something ancient and wrong. She knew, with a terrifying certainty, that this was not a person. He was facing her now. She could not see his eyes in the gloom, but she felt them. 2 pinpricks of icy malice piercing through the darkness. A shiver of pure dread ran from the top of her head down to her toes. Then she saw his mouth, a long, thin line that curled up into a slow, deliberate, grotesque smile. The smile was not one of mirth or greeting. It was the smile of a predator, of a thing that had found its prey. And just as she felt the scream tear its way up her throat, the figure vanished. Not faded, not dissolved into mist, he simply ceased to be. One moment he was there, a solid form on the edge of her bed, and the next the space was empty. The cold spot on the comforter was gone. The heavy, oppressive feeling in the room lifted, replaced by the familiar, comforting quiet of her farmhouse. But the quiet was no longer a blanket. It was a shroud. She didn't sleep again that night, or the night after. The image of that gaunt face, that predatory smile, was seared into her mind. She tried to tell herself it was a waking dream, a hallucination brought on by stress, but the memory was too vivid, too real. She bought a new alarm system, installed motion-activated lights, and even got a large dog from the local shelter. She did everything she could to feel safe, but the feeling never returned. The man came back. Not every night, but randomly, sporadically. Sometimes a week would pass, and she would begin to think it was over. Then she'd wake up, a sudden, cold dread in her stomach, and see him again. Always at the same time, 3:17 a.m., always sitting at the edge of her bed, his back to her. He never spoke, never moved, except for that slow, terrifying turn. She stopped trying to scream. She just watched, paralyzed by fear, as he turned his head and gave her that awful, empty smile. She became a prisoner in her own home. She would stay up until 4:00 a.m. every night, drinking endless cups of coffee, trying to outlast the visitation. She would fall asleep in the armchair in the living room, with the lights on and the TV playing, but she would always wake up in her bed with a cold chill and the gnawing certainty that he had been there, that he had watched her, and then, at 3:17 a.m., had appeared to sit with her. She began to notice other things. Objects moved in her house, the books on her shelf would be out of order, a favorite teacup would be in the wrong cupboard. Her dog, a large and boisterous golden retriever, would often whimper and refuse to enter her bedroom after midnight. He would stand at the doorway, hackles raised, and growl at something Eleanor couldn't see. He saw him. She knew it. He saw the stranger. Desperate, she started researching the history of the house. She went to the local historical society, poring over brittle, yellowed documents. She found a story about the family who had built the house in the 1880s. The family, the Andersons, had a young son named Elias, who was an artist. He was known for his beautiful, unsettling portraits, particularly of a gaunt, shadowy figure he called the Watcher. He claimed the figure sat with him every night, watching him paint. The story ended abruptly. Elias was found dead in his bed, an expression of profound terror frozen on his face. The official cause of death was an unknown fever, but the town whispers suggested something else. Eleanor felt a cold dread, so complete it was a physical weight. The date of Elias's death? October 17th, 3:17. The time of her own terrifying visitations. Elias had seen the stranger too. He had painted him, given him a name, and then he had died. Was that what the stranger wanted? To be acknowledged? To be seen? The thought was terrifying. It wasn't a haunting, it was a possession. A slow, patient claiming of a soul. She couldn't stay in the house. Not anymore. She put it up for sale, listed it with a local agent who didn't ask too many questions. She packed her things with a desperate, feverish speed. As she placed the last box in the back of her car, she felt a profound wave of sadness. She loved this house. It had been her sanctuary, and now it was a cage. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was abandoning Elias, leaving him with his tormentor. She decided to do one last thing before she left. She went back inside, into her bedroom.